I think we should get, Max, some quick thoughts from you about Jenin. This is really serious. This is Israel's launched a massive military assault on the West Bank town of Jenin, long like a center of resistance, Palestinian resistance in the West Bank, and it's the images are horrible. And this is Israel has used air power, like has launched airstrikes, I believe, for the first time in 2 decades on Jenin, and the images coming out are pretty horrific. So I was hoping to get your thoughts on it. You having written the book Goliath and spent a lot of time in the West Bank, what tell us like what's going on here.
Well, here's some imagery of the. Well, Jenin is part of the northern West Bank that is, along with Nablus, the historic center of resistance to Israeli armed resistance to Israeli occupation, the Jenin refugee camp. And in 2002, that camp was destroyed by Ariel Sharon. He called it the cockroach's nest and brought bulldozers through the center of the camp. One bulldozer driver, whose nickname was Kurdi Bear, was interviewed by the Israeli newspaper Yediot Aharonot about his rampage through the camp, where he said he built a football stadium by just destroying house after house. He said he was naked, wrapped only in an Israeli flag with a bottle of Jameson. And he just destroyed houses for 2 days straight. And he was kind of considered a hero. And they thought that they had quelled the resistance in the Jenin camp. There's the film Jenin, which is about the destruction of Jenin. But there's also a documentary I would really recommend to everyone watching this right now called Arna's Children, about Arna Hamis, who was a Israeli anti-Zionist whose son, Giuliano Mer Hamis, no, her name was Arna Mer, like Meir, and she married a Palestinian man and had a son named Giuliano Mer Hamis, who I actually knew before he was killed, who called himself 100% Palestinian, 100% Israeli. And he started a theater in the Jenin refugee camp with the youth who had actually fought in the Battle of Jenin in 2002. And I mean, it's said that that theater was bombed or attacked. Israel is denying it. But there were attempts to try to answer the outrage. And the Palestinian Authority came in 2005 through 2007 with the so-called Dayton Plan, General Keith Dayton and a contractor called DynCorp to train the Palestinian Authority to basically serve as an occupation subcontractor and prevent armed resistance from taking place, specifically in Nablus and Jenin. And now we are seeing, in other words, the Palestinian Authority under the Oslo Accords is prevented from defending Palestinians against Israeli violence. And now we're seeing the Palestinian Authority police stations are being attacked by people in Jenin. So what has happened since then? Since then, we've seen resistance intensify in Gaza, which sends a message to the West Bank that this is possible. It's much harder for them to get weapons, but they still manage to do so through the black market, including buying them through the Israeli military, off Israeli soldiers, and through the PA. And enough capacity has been built in the Jenin camp and in Nablus to create an organization called the Lion's Den, which transcends the factional rivalries of Hamas and Fatah and the PFLP. It's young people who are no longer interested in the sectarianism and the politics and just simply want to resist the Israeli occupation. And since 2021, they have been confronting Israeli soldiers in the streets. There was a major standoff in Nablus with the Israeli military, and they've grown stronger and stronger in Jenin. And meanwhile, settler violence has gotten more intense. We saw a settler pogrom in the village of Huara outside Nablus earlier this year, in which over 100 Palestinian cars and Palestinian homes were torched by settlers who rampaged through the center of town. If you live in these cities, you're completely unable to reach other cities, and settlers will attack you if you try to do so. And the Israeli military has checkpoints set up everywhere. And so Israel has decided to come in with over 1,000 soldiers, including aircraft, which we haven't seen since the Second Intifada, and to actually carry out the kind of airstrikes we've seen in Gaza on centers of armed resistance in Jenin, specifically of the so-called Lion's Den. And the resistance forces in Jenin are actively fighting. Here's some footage of some of the fighting. This is a Palestinian fighter yesterday fighting invading Israeli forces, and they're coming in with the same powerful bulldozers we saw in 2002 and doing much the same. The Israeli military, for its part, has said that this won't end the problem. It won't answer it, but it's the start of something, and that something had to be done. And that speaks to the political pressure that's been put on Benjamin Netanyahu by the extremist members of his, well, if you can call, I mean, I used to think of Netanyahu as kind of an extremist, but now he's the moderate in this coalition with members of the Otzma Yehudit party, the Jewish power party, who are hardcore Kahanists, who including Itamar Ben-Gvir, one of the most fanatical settler figures in Israeli history, who has called for last week, he called for the killing of thousands of Palestinians to end this problem. So the army is just there to do something. They're wreaking havoc on Jenin. They're escalating. They're using airstrikes, 500-pound bombs. And we haven't seen the end of this. The fighting is continuing as we speak in an area that was supposed to have been quelled and pacified by 2007. I don't know if there's anything to add there, except that why is Israel doing this? Well, they're doing this because they can't allow any resistance to their ongoing program of settler colonization. And this same week, even the UK and France have denounced Israel for building so many illegal colonies in the West Bank. That's ultimately what this is about. And administration after US administration has sponsored Israel with more aid each year than all of Africa receives.
That point you made earlier about how under Oslo, under the so-called peace process, Palestinians are basically like the Palestinian police. They're not able to, like, what was it you said that they're not allowed to do? They're not allowed to actually help.
They're not allowed to defend Palestinians against.
Yeah. And so just today, Abbas has announced that he's suspending security cooperation with Israel, which is a performance that we see every single time there's like a particularly egregious massacre. Then the Palestinian Authority says, okay, we're stopping to collaborate. But of course, it's completely performative, because as soon as the bodies are collected, people are buried, they go back to doing it, being a colonial subcontractor. And it's just unbelievable how long this is going on for. The difference is that it's because society has progressed in their sympathy for Palestinians and their understanding that they're living under apartheid. It's a lot harder now for pundits to get away with whitewashing this. 20 years ago, when this was happening in the Second Intifada, vocally, U.S. politicians, pundits were cheerleading Israel. And they're still doing that now, but it's more muted now. And now it's a lot harder to get away with it because people's consciousness has been expanded. But Norman Finkelstein recently published an article about something related to do with that era. So back then, when Israel was cracking down on the Second Intifada, you would constantly get people saying that all this is justified because Palestinians have always rejected peace. They've rejected Israel's generous peace offers. And there are these Camp David peace talks in the early aughts, which Clinton oversaw, and there was Palestinians that rejected this generous Israeli offer to basically give them back most of the West Bank. And it was a lie, but everybody played along with it. And now, only now are we starting to get more evidence about just what a lie it was, because as Norman Finkelstein writes about, Israeli archives have recently declassified Israel's response to the Clinton parameters, which was his proposal at Camp David. That was in July 2000, I believe. Between Arafat and Ehud Barak in Maryland, and that was going to resolve the Israel-Palestine issue for good, but Arafat was blamed for the talks' collapse. Anyway, so The archives were released recently showing that Israel, in its official communications to the US government about this, basically rejected everything that Clinton had proposed. And what Finkelstein points out is that Clinton lied. He blamed Arafat and the Palestinians for rejecting all this, and it basically exonerated Israel. But what these archives show is it was Israel that had rejected all of Clinton's basic proposals. And Clinton's basic proposals to begin with were completely unfair to the Palestinians because it presumes the right of Israel to have expelled hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to begin with, and then found their state. But basically, it's just an example of how propaganda works. The lie is told, the victims are blamed, and then 20 years later, whatever it is, we finally get the truth, but long after the damage is done. And now we're seeing the consequences of this playing out, where because of this propaganda narrative that's been built up over the years, that Israel is, just defending itself against these Palestinians that won't accept it and that don't want to live next to Jews, that's why this fighting has to continue, when it's in fact the exact opposite. It's a Jewish supremacist state that won't accept the basic rights of the Palestinians that it displaced to begin with, and that's why things like this continue now.
Well, and we also had during 2002 the wave of suicide bombing, which was precipitated by unprecedented Israeli violence in the West Bank, but it provided justification for Israel to build the apartheid wall and to subsume large parts of the West Bank and kind of unilaterally separate from Gaza and turn Gaza into a kind of open air prison, or consolidated as an open air prison. There isn't that same justification now. There's not a wave of attacks on Israeli civilians inside Israeli cities coming from Jenin. By the way, many of the youth from Jenin who had carried out those attacks had already had their homes bulldozed, because Israel bulldozes the homes of anyone who belongs to a resistance organization or carries out an attack. What you can see right now is Palestinians defending their own city. And so compare this to the justifications we hear for arming Ukraine with F-16s, arming Ukraine with battle tanks. It's Article 51 in the UN Charter, which allows a local population or a state to defend itself with arms against an invading force, to defend its territorial integrity. But because Palestinians are not granted an actual nation and at best have observer status at the UN, the Israelis say that invalidates Article 51. So what about it for a stateless population? Can a stateless population defend itself against an occupier? Of course. And the occupier it's illegal for the occupier to move its civilian population during a conflict into another party's territory. That's what's happening here. That's pretty much it. And we're not hearing anyone call for arming the Palestinians with Leopard tanks and F-16s and Javelin missiles. They are completely powerless, and they're fighting with any arms that they can get, either off the black market or with rocks.
Yeah, and there's so many differences with Ukraine, but one difference is that this occupation has been going on for decades of occupation. And every time there's any effort to resolve the issue, Israel, with U.S. backing, undermines diplomacy. And by contrast, in Ukraine, there was something called the Minsk peace process, which was supposed to end the war in the Donbass, which Ukraine and all the NATO state partners flagrantly violated, refused to implement. Which then left the people of the Donbass who didn't want to live under a coup regime with very little choice, because the government that they were rebelling against refused to engage in any serious diplomacy and ignored even the agreements that they had signed. In fact, Andrei Yermak, who is Zelensky's top advisor, recently told the Wall Street Journal, he said that a major obstacle to peace in Ukraine was Russia's insistence that Ukraine live up to the Minsk Accords. And that basically means that Zelensky, that Yermak is saying that an obstacle to peace in Ukraine is asking Ukraine to live up to deals it's already signed. So, which is a great window into Ukraine's attitude. But in Palestine, by contrast, Israel's rejected all efforts at diplomacy, and in fact used diplomacy, much like Ukraine and its allies used the Minsk so-called peace process, used it to only entrench the occupation further.
Exactly. And without any international support.
Yeah.
So the international support, to the extent they get it, is from Iran. That's one of the only states that's arming Palestine, but mostly in the Gaza Strip. And therefore, Iran is accused of supporting terrorism. When we arm Ukraine, it's supporting democracy.